Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. It's a real shame that Cyberpunk 2077 has released as a, hot pile of garbage and can't really be played on many platforms and has a tremendous amount of bugs. It's a shame because hidden underneath all of that nonsense is, in my opinion, the best game of the year. In our last episode, we took a look at how Night City compares in size, population, and crime to real-life cities. Night City is actually possible from a statistical point of view if our world gets a little more dystopian in the next 50 years. But anyway, today we're going to take a look at the wider cyberpunk kind of universe and figure out what's going on in the rest of the country. The United States has clearly experienced some massive change and diverged from our current timeline. Now, I first noticed this through my own personal playthrough of Cyberpunk 2077 when I was doing the prologue section as V with the Nomad backstory. While trying to smuggle some exotic items across the border into Night City, I noticed a map of the United States in the border control building, but immediately something was off. For one, the state of Texas was highlighted in red and called the Republic of Texas, and California, where Night City is located, was split in half. Clearly something strange and probably very terrible has happened to the United States, and we're going to find out exactly what it is. Let's start off in the early 90s. Western Europe has combined forces in order to form an economic union that could rival the United States. Known as the European Economic Community, or United Europe, this organization was headquartered in Brussels and made up with similar countries that make up the EU today in our own world, with addition to Japan. The ECC would maneuver against the United States in an attempt to shut them out of European markets, and soon it became one of the leading world powers. In 1992, the Soviet Union was on its last leg, suffering from economic recession and mass food shortages. The ECC steps in against the will of NATO and provides market assistance and other emergency supplies to the Soviet Union. The NATO nations would continue with their evil empire mentality and ignore the Soviets. Communism would end and the Soviet Union would be replaced with the Union of Sovereign Soviet Republics, mostly made up of former Soviet Eastern European nations. This new Russian-led confederacy would adopt the Eurodollar, that's the ECC's new currency, instead of the US dollar. The United States would enter into a period of paranoid isolationism. Fearing a loss of influence and power on the international stage, a series of deep state institutions would join forces and create something known as the Gang of Four. Made up of the NSA, CIA, FBI, and DEA, these deep state agencies united their political goals and essentially took over the government without any resistance. The Gang of Four would launch a quiet war against the ECC. This would be a series of clandestine operations ranging from cyber attacks to market manipulation and espionage, and it was designed to just destabilize the newly found United Europe. At the same time, the Gang of Four would escalate the drug war. The crack cocaine epidemic was spiraling out of control back at home. The US government would launch an artificial virus that attacks coca plants and opium plants in South America and Central America. In many of these areas, the drug money basically ran everything, so overnight you have local economic collapse that led to wider instability in these narco states. The Gang of Four would start the first Central American War. This would be against Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. This war, of course, would turn into a disastrous Vietnam-like affair. At one point, a Colombian drug lord detonates a tactical nuke in New York City, killing 15,000 Americans. Then an event known as the Crash of '94 happened, which led to the collapse of the US government. Apparently, in the fictional cyberpunk world, governments can't just continue printing money without consequences. The World Bank and the World Stock Exchange would collapse, the US government would run out of lenders, and federal bonds were cashed out at such a high rate that the government could hardly produce enough money to pay them out. The dollar essentially became worthless overnight, and the American economy was hit with a massive recession along with hyperinflation. The older generations were hit first. They lost their social security, investments, and pensions. There was a rise in multi-generational homes along with homelessness. Violence and unrest grew side by side with economic despair and unemployment. The US military would withdraw military assets from overseas and committed them to quelling unrest domestically. On August 17, 1996, the president and vice president were both assassinated while attending separate election events in different states. The Speaker of the House at the time was undergoing bypass heart surgery, and the pro tem of the Senate declined the office of president. Secretary of Defense Jonathan Seward steps in instead and decides to establish martial law until the crisis could be resolved. A military regime would then take over the U.S. government, and soon they found themselves fighting against the Gang of Four. In 1997, the Mideast meltdown occurs. It's triggered by a regional conflict between Iran and Iraq. By the end of the war, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Chad, and the Arab Emirates are completely obliterated in a nuclear exchange. This wipes out 50% of the world's oil reserves, and a year later, the drought of '98 occurs and reduces the Midwest of America into a parched grassland. This destroys the United States food supply chain and ends the concept of the family farm. That same year, a 10.5 earthquake hits LA, killing 65,000 people and inundating 35% of the city in seawater. Also that same year, a bunch of neo-Luddites start attacking infrastructure points all across the country. Now, basically, things would continue to spiral out of control. Economic turmoil combined with natural disasters led to more instability, unrest, which led to even more terror attacks and conflicts. The Gang of Four would continue to lead the United States in disastrous intervention wars. A second Central American war would start and devolve into complete chaos. Eventually, this Gang of Four would be ousted by an army plus CIA coup, or counter coup, I guess. As the legitimacy of the United States federal government continues to suffer massive blows, states would begin to secede from the Union. Not surprisingly, the first state to leave was Texas in 1999, followed by Alaska in 2000, then California in 2002, Nevada in 2003, and Utah in 2014. These breakaway states were technically still a part of the Union. They were just allowed to ignore federal law and create their own existing laws, but culturally and economically, they were still very well connected to the rest of the United States. In 2016, North California would secede from the Free State of California. Apparently, the Northerners in rural areas were getting tired of the increasing power of the Los Angeles Metroplex and its control of the rest of the state. The United States, of course, would be the first to recognize the Free State of Northern California. And so that's where the Nomad version of V starts in Cyberpunk 2077, on the border of North and South California. That also happens to be where Night City is located. The early 20th century was marked by states' rights movements all across the country that would fragment the United States into multiple independent and autonomous regions. Each individual state would repurpose National Guard elements and create their own state military force. Now, in general, all of the state and federal military forces would kind of work together in order to make sure that there was safety and security in the continental United States. Especially now that giant packs of nomads were roaming the plains of America in caravans and raiding and stealing whatever they could find. These were the remnants of America's formerly proud farming industry. The collapse of America happened relatively quickly, within a decade or two. The result was over 100 million American deaths within 15 years. Along with all of the problems and disasters we've mentioned before, another big issue was a lot of these states that seceded from the United States were heavily dependent on federal funding. Prior to the collapse, 30% of Americans were dependent on federal social programs like Medicare, food stamps, welfare, unemployment, Social Security, and other subsidies. These things evaporated overnight, leaving millions of people on the streets without food or safety. By 2020, the new United States would control most of the East Coast. Similar to the United States during its periods of expansion and growth in the 19th century, the federal government's power mainly controlled the civilized East Coast area known as the Bosch-Wash Corridor, or Boston to Washington Corridor. Past the Mississippi River, however, the new United States had very little power over what happened. So as bad as 2020 is going, at least our 2020 is not the Cyberpunk 2020 version, because, you know, if we were in the Cyberpunk universe right now, I think we'd be in the middle of a super earthquake, plague, / nuclear attack. You know, it just wouldn't be good. Anyway, guys, let me know in the comment section below what you think about the history of NUSA, or the new United States. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. My name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie and you are the protagonist.